the matter of the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, case number BA-096.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you.
Boom, and we're back on a presumably cold Wednesday at this point.
You know, I hope I don't have to like release this after you've been frozen to death. So take care of yourself.
I actually went and got plenty of firewood.
Good.
Because in Texas, the only assurance is caveman meat.
Yeah.
So, sweet. So I'm gonna go ahead and kick things off, Taylor, with my topic, which is gonna be a little weird per usual.
I'm
like, it's not gonna be like the
excited.
normal thing. So,
There's a normal.
Taylor,
What is normal?
what even is normal?
I can't wait.
So I'm gonna have you guess.
Oh God, I can't wait.
What do the CIA, Bill Clinton, and the Mariana Trench have in common?
They're all deep and dark. And there's things in there that we don't know what they are.
It always circles back to Epstein's list.
Exactly.
So no. I saw a meme on Instagram recently, and it featured this specific aircraft that I think we've probably all seen, but like probably don't even really think about very much anymore. And it led me down a rabbit hole where I found like a ton of fascinating info, and I thought it'd be a pretty good topic for discussion here. So I'm going to be discussing the conception, career, and the doomed to fail demise of the legendary aircraft, the SR-71, also known as Blackbird. Do you know what that is?
Cool. No, that's very exciting. You look very excited too. So I feel excited that you're excited.
It is, oh God, like I feel like every kid growing up like looked at posters of this thing, was like, I want to be in that thing one day.
Yeah. I'm totally sure.
It looks so cool. So I broke this down to several components. Like the first piece of it, the first act is going to be the conception. So
Okay.
I'm going down. We're going to take some wild turns here, Taylor. Just stick with me, okay?
I'm excited to get to the Mariana Trench because that feels like the opposite of where you want to be if you're in a plane.
That is the very last thing we're going to cover. So I'm going to keep the nail biters here until we're done.
Okay.
So you're forced to listen to me.
I can't wait.
So I'm going to start the topic of the conception of the Blackbird by starting with the U.S. intelligence community as a whole. So the further you dig into funding and budgets for the intelligence community, the more you realize how entirely opaque the whole process is and how little is exposed to the public.
Mhm.
I have yet to find a reliable source on how budgets actually work with the 18 agencies that comprise the U.S. intelligence community. Also, that blew me away. 18 agencies. That's literally what the totality of what's called the IC, the intelligence community in the United States, composed of. I think of mostly CIA, FBI, NSA.
Right.
But like, there's
15 others?
15 others, yeah.
Whoa. There was
Yeah.
I was just to interrupt. We were watching Family Guy yesterday or the other day, and they talk about Harvard, and they're like, Harvard has, illustrious alumni, and then they show Ted Cruz, Jared Kushner, and Steve Bannon, and then they show the Unabomber, and then they pause and they go, we apologize to Ted Kaczynski for putting you in that group. But I was telling Juan how like Harvard ruined Ted Kaczynski because of the
LSD.
CIA. Yeah.
They broke his brain.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I think the CIA commissioned Harvard. Harvard consented to doing it. So I don't know. I don't know who's more complicit there. But
someone is though.
So I started digging into this. So basically this is all pretty common knowledge. So the way that the federal government budget works is that agencies put together their budgets and they submit it to Congress, and Congress has to basically rubber stamp it, and they say, yep, this funding is appropriated, and things keep running. It is way more complicated than that. Like what I learned is that actually it's a 3-year process. So from when you submit a budget to Congress until those funds are actually used, it takes about 3 years. So like the process for the money that is allocated this year started in 2022. Like that's how long of a cycle that is. But what's really interesting and something that I cannot figure out is how money for the intelligence community gets allocated. I found this like Harvard research paper on it, and it also was basically just citing the same other stats and resources I found everywhere else. But one thing that I noticed is that the more I dig into this, like every now and then we'll do a topic and I can feel my own personal like political affiliations kind of moving and
Mm-hmm.
shifting underneath me. And that's kind of what I thought when I dug deeper into this, because to get to the bottom of how black budgets are spent, you back your way into it by looking at how overall budgets are spent.
Mm-hmm.
So I pulled up this stat which like blew me away. So in 2022, the federal government budgeted $4.1 trillion for the year 2023, so last year, for
Mm-hmm.
mandatory spending. Of that, of the 4.1 trillion, 82% or 3.4 trillion could be addressed by just fixing three societal problems we have: how health insurance works,
Yeah.
our ability to save money for retirement, and student
Mm-hmm.
loans.
Oh, really? Of
That's
course.
it.
I
That's it.
know.
Like those three things. So again, like I'm not advocating for this, but by comparison, all we ever talk about, like societally, is how much we spend on our military, and we spend a ton. We spend more than the next, like I forgot what it was. It was like 20, 30 countries combined or something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it is we spent 5 times more addressing those three issues
But
than we
not
do on
fixing
our
them.
military, and it's not fixing it because if you look at it, you're like, okay, so let me get this straight. So because there's no cap and limit to how companies can how much it costs to get basic medical procedures done, and because of a convoluted insurance system that creates all this middleman process in
Mm-hmm.
the middle there, we blow up our costs on that front, which means we all end up paying for it through tax dollars that we then tax to pay for the retirement of elders out of our own resources, which is going to go bankrupt anyways.
Mm-hmm.
It's so crazy. It's like just literally just fix the healthcare problem. It means people can save their own money for retirement.
Right.
It's just like, and then, and
100%.
then, and then, and then you get into like schools, and you're like, wait, so this turned into a business when? This like literally like
Mm-hmm.
$50,000 a year for a fucking undergrad degree. It's like crazy. Like
Mm-hmm.
so. Anyways,
No, agree to agree on all those things.
I went through a whole feelings thing with this.
I'm very excited for in the next 10 minutes when like the CIA bursts into your house. So
I
that'll
know,
also be
right?
fun.
The amount of Googling I did on this, I was like, yep, that's being tracked. That's being tracked. That got tracked. That keystroke was tracked. Like just literally
The men
lying
in
every
black
single
are
one.
going to show up. It's going to be very exciting.
100%.
Hmm.
So the intelligence community's funding falls under a single umbrella, which so basically all 18 agencies, it's intelligence community. That's the budget. That's where the
Hmm.
budget goes. So by all accounts, the rough approximation of how much was budgeted for the entire intelligence community, these 18 agencies, was $90 billion. Um, so
For
basically
this the year you were saying?
for last year,
Okay.
yeah, it was 2 years ago, but it was for last year. So if anybody looks into this, like I know that there's two categories here. There's military intelligence programs, there's national intelligence programs. I'm bucketing them all into one. The military
Hmm.
intelligence is significantly lower than the national intelligence. But anyways, like that's I just know that if you look this stats up, I'm just including them into one.
Hmm.
Um, this is part of our defense spending and is unique from the rest of the budget process part because budgets aren't line itemed here. So the
Mm.
obvious reason why that is because they need the ability to create what's called black budgets, which is off the book spending that not even Congress has access to. So like it is very, very like top secret national intelligence stuff.
Hmm.
And that's the point of it. The point of it is to be able to kind of create and run and operate classified projects.
And I'm
So
sure that I've been propagandized to be like, yeah, of course.
what do you mean?
Like I've watched a lot of like movies and like TV shows where I'm like, of course they need a black budget, you know? But
Yeah, well,
like, I don't know.
then I mean, like, here's the thing. I would say that after learning what I've learned here, I'm like, yeah, we do. Like,
Cool.
we actually tangibly do. Because and this project is a really good case study of why that is. And this is the only one that we really like. I mean, sure, we know of a lot of them now, but like, I don't know what's being worked on right now. Like, what's being worked on right now might be like something we won't even know in our lifetimes, right? Um, so it was from this budget, what's called the black budget, that the Air Force and the CIA joined forces because they're part of the intelligence community.
Hmm.
They joined forces to plan the creation of a plane, which at the time was codenamed Archangel, which is rad, just
That is
absolutely
right.
rad. So a little bit of background, a little bit of history on this. So in 1956, the U.S. created a spy plane called the U-2. It was
Hmm.
built to fly incredibly high and take incredibly high quality pictures of the terrain below. During the height of the Cold War on May 1st, 1960, one of these planes was flying over the Soviet Union when it was shot down by a surface-to-air missile. This was basically an incredibly huge PR disaster for the United
Hmm.
States, and there
Hmm.
was on one account, I remember I read Eisenhower told his secretary that he was ready to quit his job. Like he was just like so ashamed and embarrassed because at this time, what Khrushchev was essentially the grace that the Soviets gave America was Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA, probably did this on his own and didn't even tell the president. So like,
Yeah,
let's
yeah, yeah.
not just throw everything out as far as our negotiations on a peace treaty here.
Because he's a
So
baddie, right?
Dulles, yeah, Dulles was definitely a baddie. Yeah. Um, so again, huge disaster for the U.S. and Eisenhower and Khrushchev agree that the U.S. will never fly spy planes over the Soviet Union again. That was kind of the agreement. Like we're going to put an
Hmm.
ironclad treaty in place. It's not going to happen again. So knowing this, obviously, Alan Dulles was like, "Cool, we have a problem. Now we need a plane that just can't ever be caught."
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, of course. I was like,
the
of course they didn't really do that.
yeah, of course not. Like the problem wasn't we can't do this. It was like, okay, now we just got to figure out how not to get caught doing this again. So they approached the recipient of a ton of Black Project money, contracting Lockheed Martin to develop and build such an aircraft. So in 1962, they signed a contract to build 6 planes that at the time had the designation and still do of SR-71. That's what I've been referring to as Blackbird. So
Okay,
SR-71, Blackbird, same thing.
I see it.
The basic requirements were threefold: had to fly super high, had to fly super fast, and it had to stay completely under wraps. That's it. That was the idea. So Lockheed Martin had a division focused entirely on building projects like this. It's called Skunk Works, which is now like a euphemism used by any sort of company that has like an in-house specialty projects thing. But it
It's a
all originated
secret.
out of Lockheed Martin. Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
And basically, like if you look at the list of like the projects Skunkworks has worked on, it's like every insane plane that has ever existed.
Hmm.
So, for example, any time you hear reports out of something happening or someone citing something out of Area 51, it's probably a Skunkworks plane. Like
Hmm.
to that point, even the initial test flights done for the SR-71, they were all done Area 51 for
Nice.
context. So creating a plane that can fly high and fast enough to basically outperform any other plane or missile for that matter in the world was a pretty tall order. And what it essentially means is they had to basically invent all new processes and technologies and manufacturing capabilities, all of it from the ground up. I'll go through what it takes to basically operate this thing later on, but it's crazy the amount of work that had to go into this. They had to basically figure out how a new way for engines to work, for fuel to be stored, how to ensure survivability, a whole host of other stuff that we'll go into the details of. Have you looked this plane up before, Taylor?
I'm
You know what
I'm
I'm talking
looking
about?
at I'm looking at it right now. It looks silly.
Describe it.
It's like got like a big front part, and then it has like little engines and wings on the back. But like the front part is very like oblong and big, right?
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think it looks silly. It does look like a bird. It doesn't not look like a bird. It
Taylor,
looks more like
you
a bird than other planes.
Taylor, you say silly, I say incredibly badass.
Okay, cool. I
Yes, let's
mean,
figure out. Whoever wants, please write in. We'll do a poll. Is it silly or badass? We'll see what the interwebs have to say.
I do know that
But
we have a military pilot who is a listener, so
yeah,
we'll hear from him.
please, God, if you've ever even seen one of these things in person, like I would love to know.
Yep.
Um, so basically, the reason it looks the way it looks isn't because they were trying to make it look badass. Like the goal is this thing for it to
Sure.
never be seen. Like literally the entire objective was never be seen. And so that's why it's designed the way that it's designed. So I'm going to describe it a little bit. So the front of the plane, to your point, it's like a boom. It comes to a point like a fighter jet does, but then it sweeps
Hmm.
down really rapidly on the edges. And from the top or the bottom, it kind of looks almost like it's flat, the central fuselage part of it. And that's all
Yeah.
done because of its stealth capability. So it was
Right.
designed so that it wouldn't be readable as a plane on traditional radar. It would leave a radar signature. So the wings and the engines are integrated into the wings, and they have this cone-like structure at the very front of it, which is entirely a design component of how the engine was supposed to work to get it up to its max speed, which we're going to get into here in a second.
Okay.
So what the plane was capable of doing, no manned plane ever since has matched it. So in 1964, they built a thing that even today we have not tried to replicate. So it was capable of flying in excess of Mach 3.2, which is 2,500 miles per hour. So the in excess part was in short bursts. Some have reported claims of 3.5, but it would sustain flight at 3.2, which is the fastest you can go. Well, the fastest a manned plane would be able to go.
Did you watch Top Gun 2?
You mean Maverick? Or
yeah.
Yes.
It's great. It's great. But he flies at a Mach a lot.
He flies at a Mach a lot, yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing. Like these speeds are not that. I mean, this speed is atypical, but flying incredibly fast on one of those jet planes is not. The more critical part of its functionality had to do with the fact that its service ceiling was 80,000 to 85,000 feet high, which is like super high, like super duper high. When you look at pictures of people in the cockpit of this thing, they look like they're in outer space. They do not even look like they're flying a plane.
100%. I see that for sure.
So the reason they had to design it this way was twofold. One is because no other plane outside of what's called a zoom ascent or something along those lines. No other plane can actually sustainably fly at this elevation. A plane could occasionally get up there, but it would just be shooting straight up and then would lose all lift and just fall back down. So occasionally they were able to lock targets on this thing in the later operational history, but they're never able to get close enough to actually do anything about it. But the other more important part.
I'm so sorry. I know you're on a roll, but I have a stupid question. Is this pre satellites or like during satellites? Because aren't satellites like above this? So wouldn't that not matter anymore?
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
Yes, that is a really good point.
Thank you. Thank you for understanding my very scientific question.
No, we're talking about this for a while later on. Right. So the other part of it had to do with the speed. So the speed was also meant to outrun missiles. So even if there was a surface-to-air missile launched to this thing, it could outpace a missile. So that's entirely how it was supposed to run. Also, the idea was that given its service ceiling, by the time a missile actually got high enough to reach it, it would then need to accelerate faster. And by that point, it would have exhausted all propulsion. So that was the idea. The name, the SR designation of it stands for Strategic Reconnaissance. The purpose of this plane was to fly up, over, or to the side of any targets on the ground to take incredibly high quality, high resolution pictures. All this be stored in the plane because this is 1964. And once the plane lands, they would remove the components and then send it over to the CIA to analyze the data, interpret it, and then run it up the ladder, essentially. So, like I said, a lot of stuff around building this thing had to be unique. I'm going to touch on just a few of them. There's a ton that we could be talking about, but we don't have forever. So I'm going to touch on a few of the more interesting things. One was that flying at this speed and created a tremendous amount of resistance in the air, which caused a tremendous amount of heat to be built up. So it was determined early on that they couldn't build this out of steel or any traditional materials that you would use for airframe construction. They would have to use titanium. The problem was that the ore they would need to use for the titanium was in short supply in the US, but was an incredibly high supply in the Soviet Union, which is who they literally were trying to build this plane against.
Yeah.
So the CIA did what the CIA does exceptionally well, and they basically set up a ton of little shell companies across the entire country or the entire world and ordered in small batches the titanium they would need to construct the plane so they wouldn't raise any alarms or anything. And it took years. It took years, like during the design phase. Like, I mean, they didn't even know if they were going to do this, but they still designed. I mean, man, the ingenuity here is crazy.
I think we talked about that. We talked about something with that, like, but the opposite way. We're like, oh, it was helium. It was how in the U.S. we had all the helium and we wouldn't give it to Germany to make their blimps.
Yeah. So wild. Also, because objects that don't melt in heat expand in heat. the body paneling of the plane was loose. It was loose fitting. So when it was on the ground, it wasn't actually fully secured as one cohesive structure. It would have to reach Mach 3.2, its cruising speed, for all the pieces to actually come together and fit.
Where did I hear that about regular planes? Someone just told me that like planes are built on a moving platform because they're meant to be moving.
Well, I mean, I'm sure they are. I'm sure all of them are. Like, I know that planes do. It's like subs, right? They used to talk about how people in subs they would tie a string from one side of the sub to the other side of the sub on the inside, and then as
Hmm.
you go further down, you can see how much the string sags because the entire body is shifting and moving. Planes, I'm sure, do the
Mm.
exact same thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the piece about how the construction side of it was. One interesting quirk about the plane was that the fuel for the plane was all housed in the airframe itself. It was like circulating around the plane, which a lot of planes do this. Most of the time, it's just in the wings, but in this plane, it had to be kind of all around because it needed a ton of fuel, and its wings weren't even that long. They were delta wings,
Hmm.
which was like a little bit sloped. So the problem with that is because the skin of the plane is loose fitting, and because it expands and contracts so much, this thing would just constantly leak fuel when it was on the ground
Right, right,
because
right.
there's only so many times you can compress and come back and the fuel cell wouldn't shatter. And so
Right.
basically, maintenance workers devised a count of how many drops a minute were okay versus now we have to actually replace all
Is
this paneling, replace
a
the air
problem.
cell, the fuel cells, and everything. Yeah. So the other thing that was unique about this was just the survivability of it. So like again, if you look at pictures, you think you're looking at an astronaut, not a pilot inside of
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah.
The reason was that they couldn't pressurize the cabin sufficiently at this height. So what I read was that at the cruising altitude of 85,000 feet, the best they could really hope for was to pressurize it to the equivalent of 10 to 25,000 feet, which you'd still pass out at. But you're still not getting
Right.
any oxygen at that level. And so what they had to do was create a pressure suit. So they're inside a pressurized suit that where all their life support is dependent on this suit itself, not the cabin that you're actually inside of. And the other part of it, the other reason why they had to do this was in the event of a ejection event, which happened a lot. In the
Uh-huh.
event of an ejection, given the speed and the altitude, A, you die from just the fall because you'd be without oxygen for so long in a descent. But the other part of it was that if you were to eject, the heat your body would experience would be about 450 degrees. That's how hot it would be upon ejection. So there's no time to fumble
Wait,
for oxygen
why
or mask or anything
why would it be hot when it's cold up there? Because of the speed?
because of the speed. Yeah, because so what they were saying was that the body itself would heat up to around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit,
Hmm.
and the glass that was in front of the pilot would be somewhere in the 250 to 350 range. Like
Wow.
it gets crazy, crazy hot because of the speed of the resistance. So going into a bit of the operational history. So the SR-71 was operational until its well, there's gonna be two retirements. Its first retirement happened 24 years after it went to active service. And during that time, it was used in Vietnam, Israel, Lebanon, and obviously the Soviet Union. Basically, any global conflict the US had any sort of interest in. The stories around this and the numbers that are thrown around of like some of the missions that this thing went on are kind of inconceivable. So one of the quirks of the SR-71 was that it would take off with its fuel cells half full. The
Hmm.
idea being that the lighter it is, the better. And so it would take off. Also, leaking fuel anyways. So why waste it on
Right.
the ground? So to take off, its first stop upon takeoff was meeting up with a mid-air refueling tanker, and it
That'd
would
have been
refuel.
dangerous.
Its very first thing was to stop and refuel. So it would do that, and then it would accelerate to full speed. So like its actual cruising speed of 3.2 Mach 3.2, and it could only do this for about 90 minutes. So about 90 minutes after cruising at this altitude or at this speed, it would have to start looking for another tanker, which would find, refuel, and then keep going. It's just like a constant thing. It had to keep being refueled midair.
Oof.
So it'd be like, wow, the stories that you would hear about this from some of the pilots that flew in it were, they would take off from Sacramento and they would basically do a loop around half the country where they would go from Sacramento up to Seattle, turn back around, go over Albuquerque, down to San Diego, back to Sacramento, and they would refuel twice. It'll be like a 2-hour trip to do this whole thing.
Wow.
There was one pilot. There was a story I read about one pilot who he had dinner with his wife and kids at home. Everybody went to sleep. He goes to the airbase. He suits up. He flies to the North Pole where the CIA wanted photos to ascertain whether the Soviet Union was planting listening devices under
Hmm.
the ice sheet to track our nuclear submarines. And then he flew back home, and it was just like a couple of hours, and he went to bed. It was just
That's
like, it was
some
like
some Santa shit
crazy.
there. Yeah.
Yeah. And
I
it
know.
actually happened on Christmas Eve.
Did it really? That's
Mhm.
delightful.
Yeah.
Um, I also remember like watching like one of the last manned space missions that went up. Like they do a thing where at some point they have like one more whatchamacallit, like one more chance to bail. And if they did that, they'd land in Dublin. You know,
What do you
like
mean? Oh,
because they like go
because they're so
up, but
high.
yeah, but it's like 6 minutes. So like 6 minutes after leaving Florida, they could technically land in Dublin, but because they
So
went up,
crazy.
you know,
So crazy.
so
Yeah.
fun.
Similar to this, like this guy, one of the stories that I read, that one with the guy was going to Albuquerque, doing like a loop around 50% of the country basically in 2 hours. He was talking about
Hmm.
how when he was in Albuquerque, he could see downtown LA on one side and Denver and the Rocky Mountains on the other side.
No way. That's
Like,
cool.
so cool.
Yeah.
Um, And it was also actually one interesting mission that I went on was that it actually was used to track the route that DB Cooper went on and took pictures underneath it
Ooh.
to figure out where he might have ditched. It didn't work. They ran 5 missions trying to do this, and it didn't work because of cloud coverage in the
Oh,
Pacific
boo.
Northwest.
That's
So
what they want you
once
to
again,
think.
that's what they want you to think. They did find his body. It's me. I'm DB Cooper.
Nice.
Strange reveal.
That's weird.
So finding tangible mission history on this thing is really, really hard because I'm sure all of it is classified. The stuff you know is the stuff that pilots are talking about on YouTube, and some grains of detail come out when you look at like the planes that have been downed, because then
Hmm.
you know, okay, so one was down in the North China Sea. We know that like something happened in the engine, and then like the details are scarce,
Hmm.
but so there's not a ton of detail around this, and so that's part of the reason why it went into its first premature retirement, was because nobody really knew what it did. They just knew we spent a ton of
Hmm.
money on this thing,
Like it
and
looks cool and it goes high, but like,
yeah, exactly. And to your point, satellites, which I'm going to get to in more
okay.
detail here. So the military was trying to find places to cut its budget, but also it had a shinier, newer toy that it was trying to fund, which is the B-2 bomber, more commonly known as the Stealth.
Hmm.
So at that point, kind of like you mentioned before, global satellite coverage was becoming more pervasive, and
Hmm.
it was definitely more pervasive than it was when the SR-71 was initially in development. So people in power had this misconception on the cost of maintaining the program and how valuable the program actually was in light of other competing interests. So because of how secret it was, and because the planes like this get priced out based on how much it costs to operate them on an hourly basis, there was an
Hmm.
assumption that this fleet costs about $700 million to operate a year,
Hmm.
which comes out to about $85,000 per flight hour. But really, it was closer to 300 million. It was flying a lot more than people actually knew because it was secretive.
Hmm.
So you don't know those details. So you think it's more
Right.
expensive than it actually was. Also, $300 million in the scheme of the U.S. budget is like
I know.
a quarter to you and me.
Dumb. Yeah.
Like, so in late 1989, the plane was officially retired, just short of being involved in Operation Desert Storm, which didn't matter really because the U.S. won so decisively. But it was noted because General Schwarzkopf came out saying like, "Hey, we actually could have used this plane. Like, it would have been really, really helpful to know how people were moving and how to position people."
Hmm.
And that would self-perpetuate itself because in 1993, that's when really things started popping off like a lot more in the Middle East and with the
Hmm.
war in Bosnia. And so the military requested that Congress allocate budget to reactivate several of these SR-71's. So their argument on doing so was that typically with a satellite, to reposition a satellite to a specific point can take up to 24 hours to do. And the military was looking at this and saying, like, we can get from here, we can get from a military base in the US to over Russia, over Bosnia, over Lebanon in like 2 hours
Yeah,
max.
totally.
So time was
Interesting.
kind of the essence here. Also, because
Mm-hmm.
the plane can keep doing the same pass over and over again, it was able to quickly determine the motion of things. So what they were talking about was in Bosnia, they were trying to determine where weapons were being transported to. But a
Mm-hmm.
satellite
Mm-hmm.
hits that spot and then passes and then hits it again and then again. So it doesn't show you the real time progression of things the way that a plane
Yeah.
could.
Mm-hmm.
So so for a period of time, a few of them did return into active service, and that was until 1997 when Bill Clinton famously used a power that he thought he had, which he did not, called the line item veto. So he struck the SR-71 budget as a line item from the budget for 94, 98, and that went up to the Supreme Court, which the Supreme Court deemed was not a power the president actually has.
Hmm.
God, can you imagine how quaint that was, Taylor? Like, that's what we were fighting about as a country was like, does the president have the power to do a line item veto? That's we were so cute back then.
When the president could read and
Could read and
do stuff. Um, yeah, what a lovely time to be alive.
lovely time. Regardless, at that point, it became clear that there was so much resistance. Now the president was getting involved on this project that a second retirement was ultimately inevitable, and that's what happened. So in 1998, they went into permanent retirement status and now are basically just exhibited in museums. That's all they
Well,
do.
I feel like that's fine. They probably have new ones and better ones. I don't want to ride in
So
a plane from 1963. Do you? Is that whatever?
well, the thing is, it's not that they have. Well, you wouldn't be riding in that anymore. So there is an SR-72 in development,
Mm-hmm.
and what that is a drone. Like everything's going to drones
Yes, you're right.
because
Good
you
call.
don't have to worry about like human survivability at all, which is great. It helps a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so that Lockheed Skunk Works is working on currently, and that is kind of the next stage of unmanned aircraft. So
Wow.
some fun facts and an interesting statistic. So 32 SR-71s were built in total. 12 were lost. One pilot ended up dying as a result of the plane crashing. 0 planes, though, were lost due to enemy combat. So the mission was, the objectives were met. Like it was never
Yeah.
caught. It all went wrong due to, issues with the engine or stuff like that. So it was all mechanical in nature. It still holds the fastest route by plane from New York to London at just under 2 hours. So it was 1 hour and 54 minutes long to do
What
that
an
route.
what an, I thought that entire hour and 54 minutes, you're like, ah.
It's wild. It's wild. Yeah, there was another one I saw that was Kansas City, Missouri to New York in 7 minutes.
Hilarious.
Like crazy.
Yeah.
Um, it maintained a flight at the highest altitude ever achieved consistently by a manned plane at 85,000 feet. And one fact that I promised at the very beginning that I'm going to go ahead and deliver LeBron, and it's kind of a creepy one, is that in April of 1989, the last SR-71 to be lost in a mission actually went down.
Hmm.
And it was codenamed Ichiban. And what happened was one of the engine bearings froze, which basically caused the engine to just disintegrate and tear itself apart midair.
Hmm.
The pilots ejected safely and they were rescued. And the Navy went to work to recover the plane from the China Sea. They did that. They did their investigation, all that good stuff. It was all done like on site. It was deemed too expensive and a security hazard to transport this thing back to the US to have it scrapped. So they decided the best thing to do is to drop it somewhere where literally no other country could have the resources to pull it up.
Whoa. So they
So
dropped it in the Mariana Trench?
today, if you go down to the Mariana Trench, you might stumble on a 34-year-old SR-71 Blackbird.
That was dope.
That's crazy, right?
Hmm.
Fun.
I like
So
that.
yeah, so that is my story. It all, for me, like the do not fail part of it just goes back to like how supersonic planes are anyways. Like they're so crazy advanced and so crazy expensive to operate. Like I remember the Concorde was one of
Hmm.
where it was just like the pride of British Airways, and eventually it was just like, yeah, we're done with this. Like
Yeah.
nobody needs to go to New York. Nobody needs to go from London to New York that fast.
Yeah, like we're fine. We can just take a leisurely 10-hour flight or whatever. Um, that's cool. It's interesting. I think it's so fun that there's all those like secret, I don't know, who knows. My dad was talking about how he was like, "Oh yeah, Palm Springs is where, Eisenhower was supposed to have met the aliens and they were like, stop doing nuclear things." And he was like, "No." And then like that was it. I love that. And
I am
you and me know someone, I won't say their name, but I'll tell you later, but one of the engineers we used to work with at our old job used to work at Area 51, and he told me that he lived in Las Vegas and they would drive to a parking lot and then they go on a plane with no windows to work every day.
Yeah, I believe it.
Yeah.
I believe it. Yeah, I looked up a bunch of pictures of Area 51 too, and it's really creepy. It's a really creepy spot.
Yeah. I love an
But but
Independence
it
Day when they go there.
but I don't think it's like alien creepy, honestly. Like researching this and seeing how secretive the government is about stuff like this, it's like, yeah, of course, like they're gonna have to test this stuff somehow. And
Yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
yeah, like that
We're gonna
just it
kill
just
each
kind of
other
tracks.
before anything else happens anyway,
Yeah,
Humans will
yeah.
annihilate ourselves in before we get to intergalactic alien anything. That's the paradox.
I mean, that's the thing. You look at the plane, and again, write to us if you think it's cool or silly looking. But you look at a plane like that, and you're like, that's what we developed, like started working on in like 1958. So what the fuck is out there now that we don't know about? Like,
Oh,
what
totally.
on
It's like
earth could it
invisible
be?
planes appear. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like, what's more likely that it's like aliens that are we're seeing over Groom Lake, or Lockheed Martin is like creating the next crazy thing?
Yeah, I bet 100%. Yeah. There's a cool Air and Space Museum in Palm Springs also that is really fun. It has a bunch of old
Nice.
planes in it. You can go into like a World War II bomber and touch everything. It's fun. That's cool. I like it.
Yeah, yeah. So that's our story for today. And if you have any thoughts or want to answer our question, write to us, doomedtofellpod@gmail.com,
I
or
have,
follow us on the socials.
yeah, all the socials, Doomed to Fill Pod. I have one listener mail. Agnes, my friend Agnes, listened to the Chicago Fire episode and she wanted a little bit more context, which I totally understand, for like what was happening in 1871. I definitely want to like bring that back. So just to pull us out of the plane into back to the Chicago Fire real fast. 1871 was the Franco-Prussian War. Ulysses S. Grant was president, and in London, Queen Victoria was the queen, and she just had opened Royal Albert Hall in memory of her husband. And also, the first photographs of Yellowstone were taken in 1871. So,
Whoa,
fun
fun.
context. Other things that are happening
Yeah.
during that time. Yeah, lots of fun stories.
So Russia was known as Prussia back then.
No, Prussia was more like Germany,
Ah,
that area. And then, as we also learned today or Monday, Germany started to unify in like the 1860s,
got
probably like
it.
around 1871. So actually, it's exactly the same time. Like Germany started to unify around the same time of the Great Chicago Fire.
Wild. Maybe they're
Wild,
related.
maybe.
Probably not.
It was the the other.
Sweet.
Cool.
Well, thank you, Taylor. Thanks for hearing the story. Thanks everyone for listening. And please do rate, subscribe, do all the things, and we'll join you in a week.
Cool.
Rejoin you in a week. Awesome. We'll go ahead
Thanks,
and cut
Farz.
things off.